Dear guests, please sit down. So I'm very pleased to introduce you our speaker, Dr. Steve Goodman. So I think most of you know Steve by heart, but I would like to give you a few words. So Steve Goodman is research scientist at the Field Museum, but he has worked for more than 30 years in Madagascar. He's a keystone species of the Malagasy ecosystem, of course. But what is very impressive is the investment of Steve in education, of training of all the young Malagasy students. And he created with friends, and you can say hello to Achille, Marie-Jeanne, and Fwangi, and all the strong support of Vahatra. So they are training every year, 20, 30, sometimes 50 graduated students from Madagascar. And this is the future of our biodiversity. So there are a long list of performance of Steve to list awards for conservation societies and many publications. It's very impressive, but I prefer to rapidly give to him the floor. Steve, please.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to talk a little bit about Madagascar. So today we're going to review the history of protected areas in Madagascar, scientific research, and a review of a book that we recently published at Association Vahatra on the protected areas of Madagascar, and a little bit about the future. Probably really no need to put in this slide, but the important thing to keep in mind is Madagascar, the closest distance is about 440 kilometers from the East African coast. Seems to be a bit of a problem. The pointer doesn't work correctly. Yeah, but it skipped about 20 slides. Okay, there we go. So to properly introduce the protected areas, we have to talk a little bit about the different biomes that occur in Madagascar. It's an island about 1,400 kilometers long, the widest spot a little bit more than 500 kilometers. And in a biogeographic sense, if there is such a thing, it's an island continent. And across this considerable landscape, there's lots of stuff going on that's important to understand about biogeography. For example, climatic climes. Here in the northeast, in the Mashwal Peninsula, it's a zone that receives between 6.5 and 8 meters of rainfall per year. And down in the southwest, in the best of years, 300 to 400 millimeters. So it's really quite considerable. And then with rivers coming off the high plateau in a relatively short distance that empty into the sea, there are very few organisms on this side of the island that show specialization for lowland forest, and most of the organisms have relatively broad altitudinal distributions. In contrast, the big rivers that flow out to the west, such as this one here, the Tsirabiin, these start 2/3 of the distance on the east coast of Madagascar, and they form large meandering rivers that in most cases turn out to be dispersal barriers. A series of mountains that run north-south here. When India was attached to Madagascar, India was in this section of Madagascar, and with the splitting of Indo-Madagascar, Madagascar became very asymmetric. This chain of mountains was mid-continent, we could say, but now it's very much to the east. Flora that's rather extraordinary. We'll talk a little bit more in detail. Humid forests with lush areas. This is the Mashwal Peninsula, 1,300 species of vascular plants known from Mashwal. And as you move up into these elfin, mossy forests. This is just below the summit of Tsaratanan, the highest peak on Madagascar, and large areas of alpine forest and zones of ericoid vegetation, part of the Central Highlands. And in the west, these are the famous baobab forests of the Menebe, an area that's very, very poorly known, and highly seasonal forests. It's the same forest in the rainy season and the dry season. And then considerable areas of sedimentary rock, including the sandstones of Isalu and the different Singi formations of Bemara, south of Bemara, and Ankaran in the north. Once again, these are zones, even after all these years of exploration, very poorly known. And then the unique vegetation of southwestern Madagascar, the spiny bush. This is an area, the estimates vary between 1,200 and 1,800 species of plants, of which approximately 85 to 88% occur nowhere else on the face of the earth. So a zone of incredible microendemism. And okay, so now I think it's important to kind of take a step back before we discuss conservation actions in Madagascar and kind of underline why this could be of some importance. No need to introduce the biodiversity hotspot, but with the definition of unique biodiversity on one side and human threat, Madagascar is a very good example of what that means. Here's a vast area of forest in the Central Highlands, and this is a very unique habitat, Neoloki manambatu, and this is a species of shifaka that was just named 20 years ago, only living in that forest block. So without saying much more, it very much demonstrates remarkable levels of biodiversity and considerable problems with human actions. Now, this is a table that kind of explains the dichotomy. And the dichotomy is, on one hand, how little we know, and on the other hand, how much we know. And I'll try to explain what that really means. These data were taken from a 2003 book on the natural history of Madagascar, and it doesn't matter which group you pick. Why don't we take frogs on the top? So in 2002, when the book went to press, about 200 species, 99% endemism, an estimate probably 300 species. Today, well actually, it's not today. When I made this slide about a month ago, there were 341 species. There's been a whole bunch that have been described since, and it's estimated that there are about 500 species of frogs on Madagascar. So this explains the idea of how much we know and how little we know. This is a cartoon that was done by George Gaylord Simpson many, many years ago, and talking about the filters of dispersal. You have to keep in mind Madagascar has been separated from any other landmass since the evolution of most modern groups of plants and animals. There's some exceptions. And this is the notion of the sweepstakes, dispersal, and how certain things made it out to Madagascar and others didn't. There's been a lot of data published over the past 10 years showing how these filters work with changes in wind direction and sea currents, et cetera. But this kind of summarizes it, I think, in a very nice fashion. Now, on Madagascar, it represents less than 1% of the surface area of the Earth, and second only to Brazil in primate diversity, and 20% of all primate species on the face of the Earth occur in Madagascar, and 30% of all primate families. It's a place that's extremely heterogeneous. That is to say, if you're in the Amazon basin or the Congo basin, it doesn't matter which large river you're talking about, and you move 40 to 60 kilometers, more or less staying at the same elevational distribution, changes in beta diversity are very, very low. In Madagascar, if you move 40 to 60 kilometers, more or less staying at the same elevational gradient, which is a little bit difficult because of the topography of the island, but in any case, 40 to 60 kilometers, you can have 40 to 80% shift in beta diversity. Hence, it's a patchwork of very distinct habitats, and data good, solid data, understanding the distribution of the organisms that occur in these different places are critical to come up with a logical conservation plan. It's an island with a remarkable number of adaptive radiations. Some are only being discovered in the past few years. New families of, for example, there's a new family of birds that was described recently called the Bernieridae that encompass birds that were previously placed in 4 different families of birds. Hence, for example, amongst the vangids of Madagascar that's in the photo here, monophyletic with as much diversity in bill shape, morphology, life history traits as really any group you can find in the world. So all of these aspects underline the importance of Madagascar for solid and realistic conservation actions. And it's a great place to visit. Beautiful scenery, remarkable habitats. The guides are becoming more and more up to date with systematics of organisms, giving the right names, and very interactive with visitors, and just remarkable things to see. Now, before we jump into recent aspects, it's useful to talk a little bit about the history of exploration. This image is of a bird called a roc that comes from 1001 Nights, and probably the idea of this bird comes from an extinct eagle that was recently described on Madagascar, and well, leave it at that. Flacor was very much, I'm sorry that it's cut off, that's 1656, I believe. And so the first record documenting the natural history of plants and animals, human culture, was Flacor, and many hundreds of years ago, and this forms a very important document to understand some of the changes that have taken place. In the 18th century, there were many trips, natural history voyages, collecting specimens, discovery, and a lot of very important things happened during that period. But really, the start of the modern era has to be signaled as Grand Didier, and he and his son Guillaume, over the course of 48 years, published close to 50 volumes of the natural history and political history of Madagascar that are fundamental to understand the island. There was a period of French colonization from the late 1890s to 1960, and this is the period when the first protected areas in Madagascar were named. The fellow pictured here is Henri Humbert, who was a botanist from Paris, who was responsible for the creation of many new protected areas in Madagascar. Oh, I'm sorry, there were also many important publications and series that were started during the French era to document the plants and animals of the island. And then, after Madagascar was independent, the country went through a period where agricultural production and different aspects of manipulation of the environment were distinctly more important than scientific research. And there's a period when Madagascar was a Soviet bloc country where things basically came to a standstill. And as Madagascar was coming out of that era in the 1980s, it was abundantly clear that there were numerous Malagasy scientists that were engaged, but they were more or less in the shadows of their foreign counterparts. And for Madagascar as a country to emerge from the colonial era and have an identity of itself, it was important to advance Malagasy scientists. This is Georges Randrianasulu, who worked with Jean-Jacques Peter and Roland Albagnac, etc., in the old Orstom umbrella. Very confident ornithologist, but he never was able to have a career as an ornithologist. He was always working for other people. Another example is this extraordinary botanist, Jean-Prosper Abraham, who in many ways shows a parallel to Georges Randrianasulu. And then, starting in the late 1980s, 80s, the door was opened, and there was quite a bit of international cooperation. When I arrived in Madagascar about 30 years ago, it was clear that there were two aspects that were very much missing. The first one is how little there was known about the fauna and flora of the island. And in order to advance numerous questions in evolutionary biology and conservation actions, it was critical to go into the hinterlands of Madagascar, figure out what lives out there, describe the organisms in advance, and those in that fashion, but most importantly, to have a system for nationals to advance in their scientific careers. Here's a photo of Olivier Langrand and Martin Nicol in 1988, and as they were writing a book we'll talk about in a few minutes. And this is a photo a few years later of myself and Olivier on a mountaintop in the southwest. So starting really with the French era, there were many, many biological inventories that were made. Once again, you have to not forget the size of Madagascar and also this level of heterogeneity. And so in order to really encompass and understand biogeographic patterns, you have to get to a lot of places. And so this is a mission that was Orstam, 1972, at the summit of Tsaratanan, and it's kind of a remarkable photo. This is Caperon, a young Roland Albagnac, Rompler, Jean-Marie Betch, etc., completely an old generation. Most of them are no longer with us. So for those that know Madagascar, this map is completely misleading with all these roads. So many of these are route nationale, national roads, and you can get across most of these, but in fact, this is a national road here during the rainy season, and it's much easier rather than fighting through the mud and dealing with all that. You just park the car somewhere, and you engage people in the village, and you hire porters, and you get to the forest that way. And this is how we've spent a good portion of the past 30 years. As Dominique mentioned, we focus very much on Malagasy scientists. And so here's Shil Rasalamanana showing a group of conservation technicians doing a field school, how to manipulate animals, how to identify animals. This is a young Marie-Jeanne Vwangi when they were working on their thesis with us in these bushwhack forest camps in the middle of nowhere. And each year we try to have field schools for young graduate students to kind of a scientific smorgasbord so they can learn different techniques and decide if they're an organism-related person or a question-related person to then look for the appropriate organism. Okay, so to make a long story a little bit shorter, we have data from a remarkable number of places on Madagascar. So this map is actually out of date, and based on a recent summary that I did, we students that work with us in different combinations, we've been to about 550 places on Madagascar. And most of the data was collected in a completely similar fashion and comparable. So it forms a simply remarkable data set to start understanding what microendemism means and patterns that are logical to engage in protected area systems and making the priorities of those systems. Oops. Yeah, okay. So I know it's perhaps a topic that's a little bit sensitive, but the point of departure for all of this work is specimens. And without specimens, most of the descriptions and the remarkable number of organisms that have been named over the course of the past 30 years would not be possible. And this is a graph of a genus of endemic rodents. The genus is Eleurus, and you can see the number of specimens that were available in natural history museums of the world, a very considerable increase. Basically everything described here has broad distributions, and everything described here are microendemics. So without these specimens and associated morphological studies and molecular studies, we wouldn't know much about the endemic rodents of Madagascar. I apologize, I didn't redo this figure, but it stops in 2014. If I were to redo the figure, I'd probably have to do it every week. Right now, we're at about 305 species of mammals on Madagascar, and you can see very clearly kind of the new period of biological inventories, and basically for mammals as a whole, which is the red line, virtually exponential growth in the number of recognized species. And here's some summary. We recently published a book in late 2018 on the protected areas of Madagascar with a large-scale reworking of taxonomy of land vertebrates. And these are the figures. You know, it's since Martin Nicol and Olivier Langrand published their book, 140% increase in the number of amphibians and almost 300% in the number of recognized primates. And the figures speak for themselves, and there's no reason to dwell on them. This is kind of an extraordinary figure. The estimate now that there's 15,000 species of vascular plants on Madagascar, and etc. So in 1989, these two young gentlemen published this book, a review of the protected areas of Madagascar, and it was a fundamental resource till very, very recently, always being cited, always being used to understand different biotic and abiotic aspects of protected areas and species that occur in those zones. So the data that Vahatra and pre-Vahatra projects have collected were very, very important for a new step in the conservation of Madagascar. And that was in 2003 when the former president of Madagascar, Marc Ravalomanana, at a park conference in Durban, gave his famous Declaration of Durban, stating that Madagascar would increase its protected areas by threefold. At that point, it was about 3%, and the idea was to go up to 10%. And so everything here that's in dark blue, violet, were pre-existing Durban Vision protected areas, and very, very quickly, using good biological analyses and gap analyses, etc., there was many new protected areas that were described from the island. And because there's been so much exploration of Madagascar, it was clear that the Nicol Langrand book needed to be updated. So starting a few years ago, we decided to do such an update, and this is the book that I mentioned earlier, published by Association Vahatra in December of 2018, called The Terrestrial Protected Areas of Madagascar. It's bilingual, French and English. It's in 3 volumes, a little bit over 1,700 pages, but you have to be pre-warned if you're interested in getting a copy. It weighs about 7 kilos, okay? And it was edited by myself, Marie-Jeanne. T'es là? Je pense she's timid. Okay, well, she's here, one of the co-editors, and Sebastian Wohlhauser. We put the book together, and it was kind of a remarkable job. We had about 14,000 documents in front of us to put the book together. There's about 40 contributors, or 40 authors associated with the book, and 250 contributors. So the first volume is really a large-scale update of systems of Madagascar, taxonomy of vertebrates, a new geology map, soils, history of protected areas, legal aspects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And so that forms the backbone of the book, the second and third volumes. And Madagascar's, we cover 98 different protected areas in the book, and Madagascar's cut into these quadrants and sections, and each protected area has a number, and we follow a very strict system within the book so you can easily find what you're looking for. And then in the second and third volume, the second volume is mostly on the humid forest and the high plateau, and the third volume is the dry forest and large-scale synthesis. there are 23 different subjects treated for each protected area, okay? And once again, in a very systematic fashion. And, well, that's the text for one site. And we'll go into a little bit more detail. So, for example, this is Nosihara, Site 1. Those 20-some different subjects are covered. There's an analysis to know the elevational stratification of the protected areas, which is very useful for understanding certain patterns, etc. Maps of each protected area, elevation, roads to get to the places, all the localities mentioned in the text are on these maps, etc. And one of the things that, for those of you who have tried to work on organisms from Madagascar, the question of toponyms and synonymies and confusing literature is considerable. So we spent a lot of time trying to go through all of that. So for example, if you're in the literature and you find a site called Vatuvavi, you can go to the index, and the index takes you to this page, and then you realize immediately Vatuvavi falls within the Ambustra Vundruzu protected area. So these synonymies, we hope, will be very useful for specimen-related and geographic type of analyses. An enormous project to put together these tens of thousands of locality synonyms. And then for each site, there's a new geological map that shows the complexity of the geological structure. And these maps are available in SIG format. And hence, if you're doing work, for example, on the Meshwal Peninsula, and your site falls here, you can very quickly understand the geological aspects of where you've been working compared to a site 4 kilometers to the east or 4 kilometers to the west. So this is the new geological map. There's sections on cultural aspects, and these sections were written either by local people from those regions or the protected area managers working in those regions. The flora, kind of a remarkable series of steps were done by MBG, the museum in Paris, the herbarium in Paris, Geneva, etc., where they went to, I actually don't know how many herbarium specimens, but I think it's over 200,000 to verify where they fall as far as these protected areas. And we actually now have lists of the plants known from every protected area. Those lists don't appear in the book, but there's a website you can go to. And as MBG updates their Tropicus catalog, the list changes automatically. But anyways, we can come up with really detailed aspects of what's known, what's not known, what's identified, rates of endemism at different taxonomic levels. And more or less the same thing for the fauna. I picked a site that's relatively simple. What this shows is this is a site that's very, very poorly known. There's never been for example, for tenrecs, small mammals of Madagascar, there's never been an inventory of tenrecs, shrews, Nesomine rodents, etc. Okay? So this very quickly shows what's known and different biogeographical aspects, but of equal importance, what's not known. Lots of photos in the book. You know, it kind of breaks up our dull text in some nice way. And there's a large-scale analysis on forest loss in Madagascar, and the way that it runs is from 1996 to 2006, 2006 to 2016. And you can see everything that's gray, there was no forest in 1996. Everything that's yellow, the forest disappeared between 96 and 2006, and everything that's red, 2006 to 2016, with all the details of what went and when, and different types of forest formations. These are the data, and you can't turn away from it. This is the cold reality of what's happening. And you know, a lot of you who've been to Madagascar have visited the Karindi Forest, which is, let's see, the Karindi Forest, it's the road about here, the Karindi Biological Station. And this is the road you come on from the national road near Morandave. And over the past 10 years, there's just been massive deforestation. So this is the road, and to the west, 10 years ago, it was solid forest, and this is the situation today, okay? Probably something on the order of 12,000 hectares have disappeared in the past 3 or 4 years, and this is within a national park. And then there's also an analysis that was largely done by Sebastian Wohlhauser on NASA fire spots and fire data from Madagascar. It was something on the order of 1.2 million fire spots over an 11-year period. And this is the situation of fire in a site in the north at the foothills of Tsaratanan, a protected area known as Bemenivica. The red is the number of fire spots per year here. And the green is within 5 kilometers periphery of the boundary of the protected area. So you can see when there's fires outside, things enter into the protected area, which is shown by this photo. The fires slowly creep into the forest and diminish forest cover. And this shows the seasonality of fires. There's a section on human pressures. This is a lemur trap with sort of nooses as the animal goes across, it gets caught by its throat, moving towards fruit bait, and this still remains a very important aspect of conservation problems on Madagascar. And you know, one of the cold realities of a country that has very serious socioeconomic problems is the question of protein for people that live in the countryside. And there was a recent study that showed that families that actually exploit bushmeat in the forest, their children have a 30% greater chance of reaching the age of 5 years old than those that don't. And so these sources of protein are very much critical. There's a bundle of tenrecs coming in, a fellow illegally making turtle biltong and a fusa that was killed in the village, probably raiding the chicken coops, but it was eaten. And then invasive species is dealt with in great detail. And here in the botanical sense, and also the problem of introduced carnivores getting into the forest and transmitting a whole range of diseases to the endemic carnivores, as can be seen in this image of a dog interacting, at least in a sympatric sense, with a fusa. And the fusas now are showing lots of things like toxoplasmosis, for example. Then a bibliography of the critical references for each site. The book ends with a synthesis, or 2 chapters of synthesis. Just to give you an idea of, this is a bit of a repetition of a previous slide, but how much has been learned over the past 30 years since the book of Nicolas Langron was published. And it's really extraordinary, and it's fantastic, and it's really a clear sign of important scientific advancements. And one of the other things that's really quite remarkable is a number of Malagasy scientists not working in the shadows of foreign counterparts, but that have their own research programs, their own vision, the way things should happen, and in many ways, the future belongs in their hands. And there are many students and Malagasy researchers that are here with us at this meeting. I apologize for the slide. I did it on a long flight. But the thing that's kind of, oh yeah, I didn't line it up very well. So for example, in the book of Nicolas Langron from 1989, there was only 17 species of frogs listed for Marojejy. Today we're at 74. And if you turn to the end point, there's now more than 200% more vertebrates known for Marojejy than in 1989, on and on and on. Okay, so this is a repeated pattern. An explosion of new data that allows analyses to be conducted and shows really the patterns, biogeographic patterns of Madagascar. And there was another analysis that was done that compared forest loss in each protected area, how much forest remains in each protected area, and the state of knowledge that was rated by a group of people that have their finger on the pulse of what's known from each of these sites. And this analysis allowed us to basically come up with a list of the 10 sites in Madagascar that are biologically unknown, and that's this list here. And these are sites that need to be visited very rapidly. In many cases, the forest is diminishing at an alarming rate. And at the very least, for archival purposes, these sites have to be inventoried both botanically and faunistically. And in other cases, there are blocks of forest that there's not much pressure, but we know nothing about them. And in order to properly complete what we know about the protected areas of Madagascar and have clear prioritization of steps that need to be taken, very important that these sites be visited. So the book was financed by a large number of foundations, and we had a lot of input from different organizations. And we thank them for their help. And this is a list of people that provided images for this presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Steve. So the questions are open, but just before important information, this new book from Vahatra is available here. We have a place over there in the village, and for students, Vahatra just told us that they can have a 30% of rebate. So you can have a visit after the talks of the afternoon or at the coffee break. So may my colleagues could have the microphone for the room.
Steve, thank you. Okay, Steve, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm going to dwell on politics now. There's a new government in Madagascar. Would you like to sort of say, in terms of all of this, are you more optimistic, less optimistic? What's it looking like?
No, it's, of course, a critical question. And maybe I'll start with something that's tangential to your question. About 7 weeks ago, we had a commentary in Nature. There was an open letter to the president of Madagascar, not pointing any fingers, but trying to be very concrete and clear of steps that need to be taken to, A, advance the socioeconomic crisis of Madagascar, and also how all of that is related to biodiversity. That letter has been modified. At the ETBC 2019 website, there's a petition for people to sign. And in communication with the president, if there's X number of signatures, it's not quite clear how many, and X number of countries, he will sign the petition himself at the closing ceremony of the Association of Tropical Biology and Conservation, which takes place in a few weeks, and it'll become the Declaration of Ivatu. So if you're interested in at least reading the petition, it's at ATBC 2019, and there's a window that'll say Ivatu petition, and please consider that in sending it on to your colleagues and friends. Now, to come back to Owen's question, the president did something that's, I think, is very savvy. So there was a whole series of new ministers that were named. They were only given, normally it's a 5-year appointment, but they were only given a 1-year appointment with an evaluation at the end of the first year. And a lot is happening very quickly because most of those people want to pass their evaluation and have another 4 years as a minister. And in certain sectors, such as the Ministry of Higher Education, the person that's involved in that, she's very, very dynamic, and she's trying to do a lot of things to revamp the university system. On the side of the Minister of Environment, perhaps not as quick at action for real conservation, but he's at least listening to people, and there's hope that things will happen in some logical fashion to advance conservation on Madagascar. Owen, does that answer your question? Or?
Thank you. You mentioned the importance of Malagasy scientists and the work that they do. Nowadays, what do you see as the role of scientists from Western or more developed countries? How can we best contribute to conservation in other countries without taking work away from local scientists?
Yeah, so, I think it's a pretty simple response to help coordinate, help advance, educate, try to get Malagasy colleagues to your home institutions, work on scientific manuscripts, projects, and advance a machine, but in the sense that they have an equal role in deciding the programs and what type of research is going to be done, and actively involved in the analyses and the publications as equals rather than something different than that. And so in Madagascar, there's a law. Sometimes it's followed, sometimes it's not. For a foreigner to come to Madagascar and do research, you're supposed to take under your wing Malagasy graduate students and help them through all the different stages of their graduate studies. And so that type of support is very important. And of course, finances for research in Madagascar is basically very difficult in a governmental or in a local sense, and bringing funds in from the outside to advance interesting and important questions is really a vital role.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask you, since you have all this long experience in Madagascar, how much of the biota do you predict has disappeared before it has been described?
There's really no response because we don't know. There's forest formations that were probably unique, that is to say, are not represented in the modern flora of Madagascar, and we have no idea what lived in those zones. We've done a lot of work on subfossil deposits and understanding the interface of what happened when humans arrived, forest loss, natural climatic change, and in fact, there's a session tomorrow on paleontology, and there'll be a talk on the Pleistocene, Holocene of Madagascar. But to sum up, about 15% of the mammals have disappeared since the mid-Pleistocene, late Pleistocene, and a little bit less with birds. But that's only based on the subfossils that have been recovered. There's a whole host of things that need to be described that have gone extinct in basically the past 5,000 years. And so there's no way to really respond to your question with any meaningful data other than the interpretation of some subfossils and these vast areas of the country that have no natural vegetation. It's an interesting question in another way because there's an interesting debate that's ongoing. 50 years ago, the concept was that Madagascar was covered from east coast to the west coast with solid forest. People arrived, destroyed it, and leading to the current situation. But there's no very good evidence that savanna formations, or at least grassland formations, are part of the natural landscape of Madagascar. And hence, the measures of the rates of deforestation and how much forest remains is distorted with the concept that some of these grassland areas may actually be natural formations. So I didn't really answer your question, but gave the aspects around the question why it's difficult to interpret.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm totally fascinated by this country.
Thank you.
And recently there has been a debate that mitigation of climate change can be substantially supported by afforestation, but there's not so many places on the world where you can create new forests that have disappeared. Of course, this island is one. is that a topic at all at the national scale, that there could be subsidies from the international community of states for afforestation, and what would be then the alternative for the food supply for the people?
Right.
In the moment, it seems not very much regulated. There's just a development that's going on for the bad sake of biota and the ecosystems, but maybe climate change can be an argument to get support from abroad.
Right. So there's a piece of that history that's important to underline. Till about 10 years ago, most of the deforestation that took place on Madagascar was associated with subsistence agriculture. Okay? And there was very, very little commercial exploitation of the forest of Madagascar. About 10 years ago, that changed very dramatically, and there's now large-scale, mostly hardwoods, rosewood and ebony. But to put it in a real economic context, and this is really what we're talking about, this is socioeconomic problems rather than a biological crisis. The average annual salary in Madagascar is about $240 per year, per person. 1 meter cube of rosewood sold in China is worth about $7,000. Okay, so the dichotomy there of exploitation in irrational, rational fashions compared to the socioeconomic picture is very, very important. Now, to come back to your question, when you're talking about reforestation, there's a very, very quick dichotomy in the discussion. One is for the needs of local people, for firewood, medicinal plants, etc. And the other split, very quick in that discussion, is associated with biodiversity. And most of the forest ecosystems in Madagascar are extremely complex in an ecosystem manner. And to date, there's been lots of reforestation, but mostly with path A in mind rather than path B. The current Minister of the Environment, it's his big thing, plant trees. But it takes a lot of planning as far as what species, for what reasons, caloric content of the wood, if they're invasive or not, and also, we didn't talk about it, but a significant portion of Madagascar, open areas burn every year, and if you don't put in fire breaks, the fire jumps into those plantations and you lose a significant number of trees per year. So now, coming full circle to your question, absolutely yes. Reforestation in Madagascar is a program that's paramount to connect forest blocks, to redo different protected area systems, to kind of synthesize in a meaningful way what needs to be done to advance conservation on the island. And if there are people interested in that type of work, there are quite a few agencies and organizations in Madagascar that would be the proper context to try to launch that type of application research. Did I properly answer your question, or? Okay.
And we all can contribute by becoming carbon neutral and giving donations, but these need to be directed in a way, as you said, to develop ecosystems and not just plantations.
Right. So there's a lot of very active, viable, logical organizations working on Madagascar for aspects associated with conservation, and we can talk about those in detail, and I can give you those names. And many of them have tax-free status either in Europe or the United States, and donors that want to make those types of contributions can have their tax benefits, etc.
Hello. Yeah. I've been very fascinated about the adaptative radiations that occur in Madagascar. If I'm not wrong, I think in the last 20 years there have been discovered many new species of very well-known groups like lepilemurs, or a new species of family of bears like the tetracas, like very evident groups, no, well-known groups in other parts of the world. So, and they have incredible adaptative radiations within the island. So I would like to know if, of course, disregarding with another groups like, for example, angiosperms or which one or other group, I suppose there will be a lot of cryptic diversity within these groups that is not known. And I would like to know if is there any measure or is there any estimate to preserve areas that could harbor this phylogenetic exclusivity that is so evident that is in the island?
So another way to turn your question is really zones of high levels of microendemism, because it's at some level it's the same. Depends on the taxonomic level you want to discuss. So many of the new protected areas that have been put in place have been designated and circumscribed based on patterns of microendemism, which include large numbers of organisms that are cryptic, that were described based on phylogenetic analysis, sometimes with an integrative taxonomy approach. So yes, it's in the creation of many new protected areas. So I didn't give you the figure. In the Nicolas Langrand book, there was 31 protected areas, 22 that should be made protected areas, and now we're up to 123. Okay, so there's been a considerable augmentation. Of course, the question is, are those effective protected areas or not? But that's not something we'll talk about now. And hence, the reason why all of these biological data from inventories was critical, with phylogenies behind a whole new set of species, cryptic species described, was literally to advance conservation in the terms that you're talking about. Okay? Something that I find rather fascinating, in the new protected area book, we include hundreds of confirmed candidate species. Okay, so these are taxa that, based on phylogenetic analysis, are new. For example, for frogs, phylogenetics, vocalizations, morphology, whatever it may be. So therein is Mantidactylus species 25 in the species list, and when that organism is finally described in the synonyms, it'll be listed Mantidactylus species 25 from this protected area book. So we really tried to use the concept that you're talking about to advance in a very broad spectrum.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm still impressed the energy you keep working on this amazing country. 600,000 square kilometers. It's hundreds and hundreds. We are enabled on the Mascarene, and we are failing to target our conservation. And you're doing the job on this so vast island. So this is an important issue for island biologists. So again, go to this petition website. It's very important, and with a soon decision. And for Steve again, you can give a big clap. Thank you, Steve. Super.
Good afternoon. Before leaving the auditorium, there are some announcements to be done. So in the afternoon, you will have a poster session from 5:30 to 6:30. And you can vote for the best poster every day online on the app. Sorry. Yeah. So it's Vox Vote, and you can download directly the app on your phone and enter the code, or directly online you can vote. So we're gonna select 3 best posters every day, and one we get a prize, and all the prizes and certificates will be delivered on Friday afternoon for the closing session. Then for the poster, we provided some beers for the poster session. So you have some glasses that you can exchange for €1 deposit. So you can keep the glass at the end of the conference as a souvenir, or return it for your deposit. Tonight we have a social event at the Regional Council. There is a conference by the outermost regions, so you are all invited at 6. The Regional Council is just a few meters, 40 meters on the right at the main entrance. And then you are invited for a welcoming cocktail. So meaning that the shuttles back to downtown will leave at 8:30 only. There are public buses that are accessible for those who wants to leave early, or also taxis that can be ordered if you ask at the conference secretariat. And for tomorrow morning, the shuttles will leave from downtown like today. For those who are staying out of the hotels, if you are in downtown, please go directly to Hotel Austral, where a bigger bus is there and waiting for people for tomorrow morning. Okay, have a good afternoon.